For America, Vietnam was a war fought in distant jungles, a seemingly endless conflict that tore apart families, friendships, and ideals. For Texans, it was a calling, a duty, and eventually a tragedy that would leave its mark on generations. Over 500,000 Texans served in Vietnam: sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers, many barely old enough to vote. Their lives changed forever by a war that would define an era. Some would return home, thousands more wouldn't. This is a story of Texas and Vietnam, a story not just of service and sacrifice, but of a state soul torn between loyalty and loss, a generation of Texans forever changed by war far from home. Texans, military service has always been part of life. In a state where patriotism runs deep, answering the call to serve has felt almost inevitable. In 1964, with President Lyndon Baines Johnson, a Texan himself, escalating American involvement in Vietnam, thousands of Texans lined up at recruitment offices. They answered out of loyalty to their state, to their country, and to the ideals that they held dear. By the end of the war, over 500,000 Texans would serve in Vietnam, making it roughly 1 in every 10 U.S. soldiers that were stationed there. Around 100,000 of these men were drafted, a process that placed young lives in the hands of a lottery system. Each number called meant that a family would watch their son or brother board a plane to the other side of the world. They were all uncertain if they'd see each other again. But these weren't faceless numbers. Each person was a story, a young Texan with dreams and ambitions cut short or forever changed by the war. Across Texas, from the plains of the Panhandle to the cities of the Gulf Coast, people watched their loved ones leave. In small towns, these departures were solemn events. Communities gathered at bus stations and airports, clinging to a hope that their boys would come home safe. Parents, brothers, sisters, and girlfriends filled churches with prayer, leaning on each other for support and courage as they faced the long months ahead. But in the jungles of Vietnam, these young Texans were tested in ways that they never could imagine. Far from the familiarity of the Texas skies and rolling plains, they confronted an enemy that they couldn't see, fighting a war that seemed to have no end. And yet they pushed on, out of a duty that they couldn't deny, out of a loyalty that they had for each other, and out of a hope that their sacrifices might somehow make a difference. But as the war grew longer and bloodier, the country began to question what they had once trusted without a doubt. The anti-war movement swept across America, reaching even Texas, where families and friends began to find themselves on opposite sides of the same conflict. In Austin, at the University of Texas, students filled campus quads, gathering to chant and wave signs that read, "Bring our boys home." They held sit-ins, organized marches, and burned their draft cards in an act of defiance. These weren't nameless faces either. They were young Texans, sons and daughters of the same state, the same families that had sent their boys off to fight in Vietnam. For many Texans, especially in rural and the conservative areas, these protests felt like some kind of abomination. Military service was a sacred duty, and questioning the war felt like questioning those who were serving and dying. In small towns across Texas, people held on to their values, and they held on to them very tight. They watched the protests in Austin and Houston with a mix of anger and disbelief. Generations of Texans believed that honoring the country meant supporting the decisions of its leaders, and they struggled to understand how young people could so openly oppose what they saw was a noble fight. But families were divided across dinner tables. Fathers and sons argued over the news. Neighbors debated in grocery stores and cafes. Longtime friends found themselves on opposite sides of a line that they never thought they'd cross. The divide in Texas ran deep. It challenged ideas of loyalty, patriotism, and the very heart of what it meant to be a Texan. For some young Texans, questioning the war was an act of conscience. They saw the civil rights movement unfolding alongside the anti-war protests, and they felt compelled to speak out against what they viewed was an unjust conflict. But for others, loyalty to their fellow Texans in the field meant honoring the war, even if their doubts were growing. But as the war stretched on, the human toll on Texas became heartbreakingly clear. More than 3,400 Texans lost their lives in Vietnam, a number that would reverberate through every corner of the state. No community was left untouched. Each death was more than just a statistic. It was a family forever changed, a community forever left grieving. In the metropolis of Houston alone, nearly 300 men would never return. Communities mourned together. Churches held vigil after vigil after vigil. And families tried to make sense of all this unimaginable tragedy. Across Texas, the pain of loss settled over towns like a heavy fog that just never lifted. In small towns where everyone knew everyone else, these losses weren't just tragic, they were shattered. One family's loss was felt by the entire community, a shared sorrow that bound people together in their grief. Some Texans returned from the war, carrying physical and emotional wounds that would never fully heal. Many dealt with what was simply known back then as shell shock, what we now know as PTSD. There was little support for these young heroes. Many of them found themselves unable to adjust to life back here at home. They struggled to find jobs, to reconnect with their families, and to shake the memories of Vietnam. These memories haunted their nights and their days and their entire lives. Families who had once waited anxiously for their boys to come home now found themselves struggling to support sons and husbands that they barely recognized. Texas became a landscape of quiet pain and resilience. Communities were trying to care for those who had given everything, but returned with so little. Texas, Vietnam wasn't just a conflict overseas. The war was a turning point, a moment that transformed political identity. Lyndon Baines Johnson, a son of Texas, had led the nation into war. By 1968, he'd become a deeply polarizing figure viewed by many as a symbol of the government's failure. Johnson's decision to not seek re-election was a shock that reverberated across Texas, leaving his home state divided on whether he was a hero or a man defeated by his own mistakes. Distrust of government reached an all-time high. Texans began to question the motives of leaders that they once believed in. The political tide turned. Conservatism took root as Texans, once solidly Democratic, began to shift towards Republican values, embracing a wariness of government power and intervention. This transformation was not just political, it was cultural. It was shaping the state's identity for generations to come, even today. The war ended, but its shadows lingered. For Texas veterans, Vietnam never fully left them. Texas was home to some of the largest VA facilities in the country. It has over 1.6 million veterans today. Many of those bear the lasting scars, visible and invisible, of Vietnam. For these men, reintegration was a second battle. The public opinion surrounding Vietnam made it hard for them to feel accepted. Many faced judgment, indifference, or worse, they faced silence. The celebrations and gratitude that followed other wars was absent. Texas worked to care for these veterans, with communities and organizations rallying to provide resources and support. But many veterans would struggle alone, wrestling with a trauma that they had no words or emotions to express. Today, Texas continues to honor Vietnam veterans with memorials and ceremonies that seek to fill the silence that once greeted them. In places like Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio, the state's veterans centers offer not just medical care, but a place of community, of understanding. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Austin is etched with the names of those who never returned. Each name is a reminder of this cost of war, a reminder that these sacrifices cannot and should not be forgotten. Well, decades have passed since the last American troops left Vietnam. But for Texans, the memory of this war lives on. The state remembers, honors, and carries forward lessons learned. A promise to never forget the sacrifices of those who served and the toll exacted on those who stayed behind. Texas learned through heartbreak that war is more than a battle. It's the lives that are left behind, the memories that fade but never fully disappear. The Vietnam War has become a scar, a story shared by generations who have come to understand that patriotism can mean questioning and that loyalty can mean loss. They also understand that healing is a process that takes time, or it may never happen at all. For Texas, Vietnam remains a quiet reminder of a cost of duty, the weight of sacrifice, and the enduring strength of our people. And in remembering and honoring and perhaps recognizing some way that Texas finds a way not to heal, but we create a deeper understanding of the complex legacy of these years, a legacy of resilience, of unity, and of a state's promise to never forget. I'm journalist Matt Pierce. Thank you for joining me.